The emergency radio crackled with desperation at 3:47 a.m. A commercial airliner carrying 312 passengers was losing altitude fast over the Pacific Ocean, its engines failing one by one. The nearest airport was still 200 miles away, and weather conditions were brutal. Every second counted. In the crowded emergency response center, seasoned pilots and air traffic controllers scrambled to coordinate the most complex rescue operation in aviation history. Maps spread across tables, voices shouted coordinates, and phones rang endlessly. But when a quiet woman in worn jeans and a faded jacket stepped forward to offer her help, she was met with dismissive glances and barely concealed eye rolls. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," one official said, not even looking up from his charts. "We need experienced professionals right now, not civilians getting in the way." What they didn't know was that Sarah Chun had more flight hours in extreme weather conditions than any pilot in that room. What they didn't know was that she had successfully executed 17 emergency landings in conditions that would make veteran pilots break into cold sweats. What they didn't know was that the civilian they were brushing aside was about to become the only thing standing between 312 innocent lives and certain death. Sometimes the person you least expect to be a hero turns out to be exactly the hero you need. And sometimes, the very people who should know better are the last ones to recognize greatness when it's standing right in front of them. This is the story of the night when assumptions nearly cost hundreds of lives. And one woman's quiet determination changed everything. Sarah Chun pulled her jacket tighter against the driving rain as she hurried across the tarmac toward the control tower. The storm that had been brewing all evening was now unleashing its full fury on Seattle's Emergency Aviation Center. Lightning split the sky every few seconds, illuminating the chaos of emergency vehicles and personnel rushing between buildings. She had been at home, trying to sleep after a long day of crop dusting in rural Washington, when her police scanner picked up the emergency transmission. A United Airlines flight from Tokyo to Los Angeles was in serious trouble somewhere over the North Pacific. Engine failure, severe weather, and rapidly diminishing fuel. The kind of situation that made even the most experienced pilots break into cold sweats. Sarah knew she should probably stay home. After all, she was just a crop duster. Her small Cessna and agricultural routes were a far cry from commercial aviation. But something about the urgency in the radio dispatcher's voice had pulled her from her bed and into her truck. She couldn't shake the feeling that she might be able to help somehow. The emergency response center was buzzing with activity when she arrived. The main floor was packed with air traffic controllers, emergency coordinators, Coast Guard officials, and several commercial airline pilots who had been called in as consultants. Large monitors displayed weather radar, flight paths, and constantly updating information about the endangered aircraft. Sarah approached the main desk where a harried-looking man in a crisp uniform was coordinating communications between different agencies. His name tag read Director Morrison. She waited for a break in his conversation before speaking up. "Excuse me, I heard about the emergency on my scanner. I'm a pilot, and I was wondering if there's anything I can do to help," she said quietly. Morrison barely glanced at her. He was in his 50s, with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge during crises. His eyes took in her appearance quickly, the worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and work boots that still had traces of mud from the fields she'd been flying over earlier. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. We appreciate your concern, but we have the situation under control. Professional aviation personnel only," he said dismissively, already turning back to his radio. Sarah stood there for a moment, unsure whether to press the issue or simply leave. Around her, she could hear fragments of urgent conversations. The plane was still 3 hours out from any suitable landing strip. Weather conditions were worsening. Fuel calculations were getting tighter by the minute. She moved toward a group of commercial pilots who were huddled around a weather map, their voices tense with concern. "The thing is," one of them was saying, "even if we can guide them to an alternate airfield, landing in these conditions is going to be nearly impossible. These aren't the kind of crosswinds and visibility issues that most commercial pilots train for." Another pilot nodded grimly. "And with potentially damaged engines, the margin for error is essentially zero. One mistake, and we're looking at a catastrophic crash." Sarah stepped closer, studying the weather patterns on the map. The storm system was massive, stretching across hundreds of miles of ocean. But there were pockets, small windows where an experienced pilot might be able to thread the needle between the worst of the turbulence and the jagged coastline. "What about approaching from the north?" she suggested quietly. If they could adjust their flight path about 15 degrees, they might be able to avoid the worst of the wind shear. The pilots turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from surprise to annoyed. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and captain's stripes on his uniform, frowned. "Miss, I don't think you understand the complexity of what we're dealing with here. This isn't a small aircraft situation. We're talking about a massive commercial jet with hundreds of souls on board," he said patronizingly. "I understand that," Sarah replied calmly. "But weather patterns behave the same way regardless of aircraft size. I've flown in conditions like this before." Another pilot laughed, not unkindly but clearly skeptical. "Flying a Cessna in bad weather is quite different from landing a 747 with engine problems. I think it's best if you let the professionals handle this." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with frustration, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, I just thought the northern approach might be worth considering." She backed away from the group, feeling foolish for having spoken up. Maybe they were right. Maybe her experience with small aircraft really didn't translate to a situation like this. She found herself standing near the back of the room, watching the controlled chaos unfold around her. But as she listened to the ongoing discussions, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The pilots and coordinators were all focused on getting the plane to the nearest major airport, which meant a straight-line approach through the heart of the storm. They were thinking in terms of normal procedures and standard protocols. Sarah's mind worked differently. Years of crop dusting had taught her to think creatively about weather, to find the paths that others might miss, to make split-second decisions based on instinct and experience rather than just following established procedures. She had learned to read the subtle signs that computers and instruments sometimes missed. On the main screen, she could see the real-time position of the endangered aircraft. It was still hours away, but already she could see that the storm was intensifying along its projected path. The commercial pilots were right that this was an incredibly dangerous situation, but their solutions all seemed to involve fighting directly against the worst of the weather. A new voice crackled over the radio, the pilot of the endangered aircraft himself. His voice was steady but tense. "Seattle Center, this is United 847. We've lost our number 2 engine completely, and number 3 is running rough. Fuel situation is becoming critical. We need options." The room fell silent except for the hiss of the radio. Director Morrison grabbed the microphone. "United 847, this is Seattle Emergency Center. We're working on multiple options for you. Stand by for weather routing update." But as Sarah listened to the subsequent discussions about routing and approach vectors, she realized that none of the solutions being proposed would actually solve the fundamental problem. They were all variations on the same theme, trying to power through the storm rather than working with it. She thought about the crop dusting she'd done earlier that day. There had been a smaller weather system moving through, and she'd had to constantly adjust her route to work around the wind patterns rather than fighting against them. It required patience and a willingness to take a longer path to reach your destination safely. Maybe that was exactly what this situation needed. Sarah pulled out her phone and quietly looked up the current weather data from several different sources. She cross-referenced wind speeds, pressure systems, and radar patterns. The more she studied the information, the more convinced she became that there was a viable alternative approach that no one in the room was considering. The question was whether anyone would be willing to listen to the crop duster in the back of the room. She took a deep breath and started walking toward Director Morrison again. This time, she wasn't going to be polite about being dismissed. 312 lives were hanging in the balance, and politeness wasn't going to save them. But as she approached the central command area, one of the commercial pilots stepped directly into her path. "Miss, I think we already explained that this isn't the place for amateur input. These situations require professional expertise," he said firmly. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Sarah looked past him toward the screens showing the aircraft's position and the weather data. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to disaster. Every moment spent on protocol and procedure was a moment that might cost hundreds of lives. "I understand your concerns," she said quietly, "but I think you might want to hear what I have to say." The commercial pilot who had blocked Sarah's path crossed his arms and shook his head. "Miss, I really don't think you understand what's at stake here. We can't afford to waste time on well-meaning but inexperienced suggestions." Sarah looked him directly in the eye. "Captain, what's your total flight time in severe weather conditions?" The question caught him off guard. "I have over 15,000 total flight hours, if you must know. 22 years of commercial aviation experience." "That's impressive," Sarah replied calmly. "How many emergency landings have you performed in zero visibility conditions?" The pilot's confident expression wavered slightly. Well, that's not really something that comes up often in commercial aviation. We have protocols to avoid those situations. I see. And how many times have you successfully landed an aircraft when all your instruments were giving you conflicting information? By now, several other people in the room were starting to pay attention to the conversation. Director Morrison looked over with annoyance. Miss, what exactly is your point here? Morrison interrupted. We don't have time for games. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted several cards and certificates, laying them out on the nearest table where everyone could see them. My point is that you might want to know who you're dismissing, she said quietly. The first document was a pilot's license, but not the standard private pilot certificate most people would expect. It was an airline transport pilot license, the highest level of pilot certification available. The second was a certificate showing her qualification to fly multiple types of aircraft, including several models of commercial jets. The third was a commendation from the Federal Aviation Administration. But it was the fourth document that made everyone in the vicinity stop talking. Air Force Distinguished Flying Cross. Director Morrison read aloud, picking up the certificate with shaking hands. For extraordinary heroism while participating in aerial flight. Sarah nodded. I spent 8 years as a military pilot before transitioning to civilian aviation. I've logged over 2,800 hours flying in combat zones, extreme weather conditions, and emergency situations that most pilots will never encounter. I've successfully completed 43 emergency landings in conditions ranging from sandstorms to hurricane-force winds. The room had fallen completely silent except for the continued radio chatter from the emergency situation. Every eye was now focused on the woman they had been dismissing as an amateur just minutes earlier. Before I started crop dusting, I was a test pilot for experimental aircraft. I've flown prototypes that weren't supposed to fly, landed planes that had no business staying in the air, and brought home aircraft that other pilots had written off as total losses. Captain Reynolds, the commercial pilot who had been so dismissive earlier, stared at the certificates spread across the table. Why didn't you say any of this when you first arrived? Sarah gathered her documents and put them back in her wallet. Because I shouldn't have to prove my qualifications to offer help in an emergency situation. A good idea is a good idea regardless of who suggests it. Director Morrison cleared his throat, looking embarrassed. Ms. Chun. Sarah Chun. Ms. Chun, I apologize for our earlier dismissal. Given your background, we would certainly welcome your input on this situation. Sarah nodded toward the main display screen. The aircraft is currently following a direct route toward Seattle, which will take it through the heart of the storm system. Every solution I've heard discussed involves trying to power through the worst weather conditions. But there's another option that no one seems to be considering. She approached the weather map and pointed to an area north of the plane's current position. If they adjust their heading to take them along this route, they can avoid the most severe turbulence and wind shear. It's a longer path, but it would give them much better conditions for an emergency landing. Captain Reynolds studied the proposed route. That would add at least 40 minutes to their flight time. With their fuel situation, that might not be feasible. Actually, it would be more efficient, Sarah explained. Fighting through severe turbulence and headwinds burns fuel much faster than taking a longer route through calmer air. The extra distance would be more than offset by the improved fuel efficiency. The air traffic controller who had been monitoring the flight looked up from his radio equipment. But that route would take them away from all the major airports. Where exactly would they land? Sarah had been waiting for that question. Fairchild Air Force Base, just west of Spokane. The runway is long enough for a commercial aircraft. They have full emergency services available, and, most importantly, the weather conditions there are much more manageable. An Air Force Base? Morrison frowned. We can't just redirect a commercial flight to a military installation without proper authorization. In an emergency situation like this, military bases are required to provide assistance to civilian aircraft, Sarah replied. I've coordinated similar situations before. The paperwork is secondary to saving lives. One of the younger controllers spoke up. But even if we could get them to Fairchild, landing a damaged commercial jet at an unfamiliar airfield in these weather conditions would be incredibly risky. We need someone with extensive experience in both commercial aviation and military airfield procedures. The implication hung in the air. Everyone in the room was starting to realize that Sarah wasn't just suggesting a solution. She might be the only person available who could actually execute it. Director Morrison looked around the room at his team of experts, then back at Sarah. Ms. Chun, hypothetically speaking, Would you be willing to serve as an advisory pilot for this operation? Sarah had been hoping the question would eventually come up, but she kept her expression neutral. I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to help save those people. Advisory pilot? Captain Reynolds looked confused. What exactly does that mean? Morrison explained. In extreme emergency situations, we sometimes bring in specialists to provide real-time guidance to aircraft in distress. They work directly with the aircraft's pilots via radio, essentially serving as an additional crew member who can provide expertise in specific areas. In this case, Sarah added, it would mean helping guide the aircraft through the weather system using techniques that aren't typically part of commercial pilot training. Military pilots learn to operate in conditions that civilian aviation generally tries to avoid. The radio crackled with another transmission from United 847. Seattle Center, we're encountering increasingly severe turbulence. Request immediate update on approach options. Director Morrison grabbed the microphone and looked at Sarah. United 847, this is Seattle Center. We have a weather routing specialist here who believes we may have a better approach option for you. Stand by for detailed briefing. He handed the microphone to Sarah. After years of crop dusting in rural areas, this was her first time communicating with a commercial aircraft in an emergency situation since leaving the military. But as she pressed the talk button, her training and experience took over. United 847, this is Sarah Chun, Emergency Weather Routing Specialist. I'm going to recommend a course correction that will get you out of the worst of this storm system and route you toward better landing conditions. Are you prepared to copy new coordinates? Copy, Seattle. United 847 is ready for routing information. Sarah looked around the room at the faces watching her intently. Some still showed skepticism, others curiosity, and a few reflected the beginning of hope. She realized that this was the moment where everything would change. Either she would prove that her unconventional approach could work, or she would take responsibility for the consequences if it failed. She took a deep breath and began transmitting the new flight path that could either save 312 lives or put them in even greater danger. The next 20 minutes would determine whether Sarah's unconventional approach would save lives or become a catastrophic mistake. As United 847 began following her recommended course correction, every person in the emergency center watched the radar screens with intense focus. United 847, adjust heading to 045 degrees and begin gradual descent to flight level 280, Sarah instructed calmly into the microphone. You should start experiencing reduced turbulence within the next 8 minutes. The voice that came back from the aircraft was tense, but professional. Copy new heading. Question for routing specialist. Our fuel calculations show this path will consume more fuel than our previous direct route. Can you confirm this is still our best option? Sarah had anticipated this concern. United 847. That calculation is based on standard fuel consumption rates. In severe turbulence, aircraft burn approximately 30% more fuel due to constant throttle adjustments and fighting against wind resistance. The calmer air along this route will actually improve your fuel efficiency significantly. Director Morrison leaned over to whisper in her ear. Are you certain about those calculations? If you're wrong about the fuel consumption. I'm certain, Sarah replied quietly, never taking her eyes off the weather display. But there's something else we need to address. She turned to address the room. The approach to Fairchild Air Force Base is going to require techniques that aren't standard in commercial aviation training. The runway configuration and approach patterns are designed for military aircraft with different capabilities. Captain Reynolds frowned. What exactly are you suggesting? Sarah pulled up the airfield diagram on one of the computer terminals. Fairchild has parallel runways, but the approach path we'll need to use requires a steeper descent angle than most commercial pilots are comfortable with. In these weather conditions, we'll also need to use a technique called energy management landing, essentially using the aircraft's momentum and gravity to compensate for the unreliable engine power. The air traffic controller looked up from his equipment. Ms. Chun, are you suggesting that you should be providing direct flight instruction to a commercial aircraft captain during an emergency landing? I'm suggesting that I should be prepared to do whatever is necessary to get those people safely on the ground, Sarah answered firmly. This isn't about ego or protocol. It's about using every available resource to save lives. The radio crackled again. Seattle Center, this is United 847. We're following the new heading and, wait, we're definitely experiencing reduced turbulence. The ride is smoothing out significantly. A collective sigh of relief went through the room. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The first part of her plan was working. United 847, That's excellent news. Continue on current heading for another 15 minutes. Then, we'll begin preparing for your approach to Fairchild Air Force Base. Be advised that this will be a non-standard approach requiring specific procedures. Copy, Seattle. United 847 is prepared for non-standard approach procedures. Director Morrison pulled Sarah aside. Ms. Chun, I need to ask you directly. Are you qualified to guide a commercial aircraft through a military airfield landing? Sarah met his gaze steadily. I've logged over 400 hours as a flight instructor, including emergency procedure training for commercial pilots transitioning to military aircraft. I've personally executed 17 emergency landings at Fairchild under various weather conditions. If anyone in this room is qualified to guide them through this approach, it's me. But the liability Morrison started to say. The liability of doing nothing is 312 deaths, Sarah interrupted. The liability of trying something unconventional is the possibility of failure. Those aren't equivalent risks. Captain Reynolds had been quietly studying the weather data and approach charts. He looked up with a troubled expression. Ms. Chun, I have to say that your weather routing appears to be working perfectly. But I'm concerned about the landing phase. Even with your experience, talking a commercial crew through a military-style approach in severe weather conditions over the radio seems extremely risky. Sarah had been thinking about the same problem. Radio guidance was one thing, but the complexity of what they were attempting might require more direct intervention. You're absolutely right, she said, which is why I think I need to be in the air, not on the ground. The room fell silent. Morrison stared at her. What exactly are you proposing? Fairchild has several aircraft available for emergency operations. I can take off in a smaller aircraft and provide direct visual guidance to United 847 during their approach. I can assess the wind conditions in real time, guide them through the approach pattern, and provide immediate feedback about their descent angle and approach speed. You want to fly escort for a commercial aircraft in the middle of a storm? Captain Reynolds looked incredulous. It's not unprecedented, Sarah explained. Military emergency procedures include escort guidance for aircraft in distress. A skilled pilot in a smaller, more maneuverable aircraft can provide real-time information that ground-based controllers simply can't match. Morrison was already shaking his head. Ms. Chun, I appreciate your willingness to help, but I can't authorize a civilian pilot to take off in these weather conditions for an escort mission. The liability alone Then, don't authorize me as a civilian pilot, Sarah interrupted. Authorize me as a military consultant. My Air Force commission was never formally terminated. I transitioned to inactive reserve status. In an emergency situation, I can be recalled to active duty for specific operations. The suggestion was so unexpected that Morrison actually stepped backward. You're suggesting we reactivate your military commission for this operation? I'm suggesting we use every available resource to save 312 lives, Sarah replied calmly. The paperwork can be sorted out later. One of the younger controllers spoke up hesitantly. Is that actually legal? In an emergency situation involving potential mass casualties, military personnel can be activated for civilian rescue operations under the Federal Emergency Management Agency protocols, Sarah explained. It happens more often than you might think. Morrison looked around the room at his team, then at the radar screen showing United 847's position. The aircraft was still over an hour away from Fairchild, but time was running short for making critical decisions. What aircraft would you need for this escort mission? He asked finally. Sarah had already thought about this. Ideally, something fast enough to keep up with a commercial jet, but nimble enough to handle severe weather conditions. A T-38 trainer would be perfect, but I could work with anything that's available. And you're confident you could handle these weather conditions in a military aircraft? I'm confident that 312 people deserve to have every possible advantage during their emergency landing, Sarah replied. Flying escort in bad weather is something I've done dozens of times. It's exactly the kind of situation I trained for during my military service. The radio interrupted their conversation. Seattle Center, this is United 847. We're approaching the coordinates for our next heading change. Also be advised that our number 3 engine is now running very rough. We may need to shut it down completely. Sarah grabbed the microphone immediately. United 847, if you need to shut down another engine, do it now while you're in relatively calm air. Don't wait until you're dealing with approach procedures. Copy, Seattle. Shutting down number 3 engine now. Morrison looked at Sarah with new understanding. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional approaches might no longer be sufficient. Ms. Chun, he said formally, I'm going to contact Fairchild Air Force Base and Request immediate activation of emergency escort protocols. How long would you need to get airborne? Sarah checked her watch. 15 minutes to reach the base, 10 minutes for aircraft preparation, 5 minutes for takeoff procedures. I could be airborne in 30 minutes. And United 847? They'll be beginning their initial approach in about 45 minutes. That gives us a 15-minute window to position for escort. Morrison nodded decisively. Do it. I'll take full responsibility for this decision. As Sarah headed for the door, Captain Reynolds called after her. Ms. Chun, for what it's worth, I hope I'm wrong about this being too risky. Sarah turned back with a slight smile. Captain, in my experience, the riskiest thing you can do in an emergency is stick too closely to normal procedures. Sometimes the only way to save lives is to try something that's never been done before. 20 minutes later, she was driving through the storm toward Fairchild Air Force Base, knowing that she was about to attempt one of the most challenging rescue operations in aviation history. The drive to Fairchild Air Force Base took Sarah through some of the worst weather she had ever encountered on the ground. Rain hammered her windshield so hard that even with the wipers on maximum speed, visibility was reduced to mere feet. Lightning cracked across the sky every few seconds, illuminating a landscape that looked more like a war zone than rural Washington. But, as challenging as the ground conditions were, Sarah knew they were nothing compared to what she was about to face in the air. Flying escort for a commercial aircraft in these conditions would push both her skills and her aircraft to their absolute limits. She arrived at the base to find a flurry of activity. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway, crash and rescue teams were conducting final equipment checks, and a small crowd of personnel had gathered near the control tower. Word of the unconventional rescue attempt had spread quickly through the base. Colonel Martinez, the base operations commander, met her at the main gate. He was a stocky man in his late 40s with the bearing of someone who had seen plenty of unusual situations during his military career. Ms. Chun, I have to say that this is one of the more irregular requests we've received, he said as he led her toward the aircraft hangar. But, given the circumstances, we're prepared to provide whatever support you need. What aircraft do you have available? Sarah asked, having to raise her voice over the sound of the wind and rain. We've prepared AT-38 trainer for you. It's fast, highly maneuverable, and our maintenance crew has double-checked all systems. But, I have to ask, when was the last time you flew one of these? Sarah smiled grimly. About 6 months ago. I've been maintaining my qualifications on military aircraft as part of my reserve status. The muscle memory doesn't fade as quickly as you might think. They reached the hangar where the T-38 was waiting. The sleek, white aircraft looked almost delicate compared to the massive commercial jets Sarah would be escorting, but she knew it was precisely the right tool for the job. Fast enough to keep pace with a commercial aircraft, but small and agile enough to handle the severe turbulence that would make this mission so dangerous. Weather update, Colonel Martinez said, consulting a tablet computer. Conditions are actually worsening. We're seeing sustained winds of 45 knots with gusts up to 70. Visibility is down to less than half a mile in heavy rain. What about United 847? Sarah asked as she began her pre-flight inspection of the T-38. They're about 20 minutes out from beginning their approach. Still flying on 1.5 engines, fuel situation critical. The good news is that your weather routing worked perfectly. They've had much smoother flying conditions for the last 40 minutes. Sarah nodded as she checked the aircraft's control surfaces and instruments. Everything looked good, but she knew that no amount of mechanical perfection would matter if she couldn't handle the psychological pressure of what she was attempting. Colonel, I need you to understand something, she said as she completed her inspection. What I'm about to attempt has never been done before under these conditions. I'm going to be flying escort for a crippled commercial aircraft through a severe storm, trying to guide them to a landing at an airfield they've never seen before. If anything goes wrong, Ms. Chun, Colonel Martinez interrupted gently, I've been briefed on your background. I know exactly what you're capable of, and I know what's at stake here. You have the full support of this base and everyone on it. 10 minutes later, Sarah was strapped into the cockpit of the T-38, running through her final pre-flight checks. The radio crackled with updates from the emergency center in Seattle. Fairchild Base, this is Seattle Emergency Center. United 847 is beginning initial descent and will be entering your airspace in approximately 12 minutes. Sarah keyed her radio. Seattle Center, this is Escort 1, requesting immediate clearance for emergency takeoff. Escort 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Weather conditions are below normal minimums, but emergency authorization is approved. Good luck. As Sarah taxied toward the runway, she could see emergency vehicles positioning themselves along the landing strip. Crash trucks, ambulances, and fire rescue equipment were all standing by, their red and blue lights flashing through the rain and darkness. The takeoff was the most challenging part of the entire operation. As soon as Sarah released the brakes and began her takeoff roll, powerful crosswinds tried to push the T-38 off the center line of the runway. She had to use constant rudder corrections to keep the aircraft tracking straight, and when she finally rotated and lifted off, the turbulence immediately grabbed the small jet and shook it like a toy. Fairchild Tower, Escort 1 is airborne and climbing, she reported, fighting to keep her voice steady as the aircraft bucked and pitched through the severe turbulence. Copy, Escort 1. Be advised that United 847 is now on approach frequency. You can contact them directly on channel 121.5. Sarah switched frequencies and immediately heard the voice of the United Airlines captain. He sounded calm, but tense, the way pilots are trained to sound even in the most desperate situations. United 847, this is Escort 1. I'm AT-38 aircraft positioned to provide visual guidance for your approach to Fairchild Air Force Base. There was a brief pause before the response. Escort 1, this is Captain Williams on United 847. We're not sure we understand. You're flying escort in these weather conditions. That's affirmative, United 847. I'm going to position myself ahead of your approach path and provide real-time information about wind conditions, runway alignment, and approach angle. This will essentially give you an extra set of eyes for the most critical part of your landing. Another pause. Escort 1, we appreciate the assistance, but we have to ask, what are your qualifications for this type of operation? Sarah had been expecting the question. United 847, I'm a former Air Force pilot with extensive experience in emergency escort operations. I've logged over 2,800 hours in adverse conditions and have successfully guided 17 emergency landings at this specific airfield. Copy, Escort 1. We're willing to try anything at this point. Our fuel situation is critical, and we're down to one reliable engine. Over the next few minutes, Sarah fought through the turbulence to position herself approximately 2 miles ahead of United 847's approach path. Through the rain and darkness, she could barely make out the lights of Fairchild's runway in the distance, but her instruments showed her exact position relative to the landing strip. United 847, Escort 1 is in position. I have visual contact with the runway and am monitoring wind conditions along your approach path. Copy, Escort 1. We're beginning our final descent now. This was the moment when everything would be decided. Sarah watched her instruments carefully, noting how the wind conditions changed as she flew along the approach path. The turbulence was severe, but it followed predictable patterns, information that could be crucial for the commercial aircraft following behind her. United 847, be advised that you'll encounter moderate to severe turbulence starting in about 30 seconds. Recommend reducing approach speed by 10 knots to maintain better control authority. Copy, reducing approach speed. Sarah could see the massive shape of the United Airlines jet appearing through the storm behind her, its landing lights cutting through the rain and darkness. The sight was both impressive and terrifying, a huge aircraft limping towards safety on minimal power, depending entirely on the guidance she was providing. United 847, you're slightly right of center line. Recommend small correction to the left. You're looking good for approach angle. The next 10 minutes would test every skill Sarah had learned during her years as a military pilot. She had to stay ahead of the commercial jet while constantly monitoring and reporting wind conditions, runway alignment, and approach parameters. At the same time, she had to fly her own aircraft safely through conditions that were pushing both her and the T-38 to their limits. United 847, you're encountering the wind shear zone now. This will last for about 40 seconds. Then, you should have smoother air for the final approach. Copy, Escort 1. This is actually working. We can see you ahead of us, and your reports are matching exactly what we're experiencing. As they approached the final mile before touchdown, Sarah realized that her unconventional plan was actually going to work. The real-time guidance was giving the commercial pilots the exact information they needed to compensate for the challenging conditions. United 847, you are cleared for landing. Runway in sight, centerline alignment good, approach speed optimal. You're going to make it. The final approach of United 847 unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between Sarah's T-38 and the massive commercial aircraft following behind her. Through the rain and turbulence, she continued providing real-time guidance as the United jet descended toward Fairchild's runway. United 847, you're passing through 500 feet, Sarah reported, her own aircraft now positioned parallel to the landing strip. Wind is steady at 40 knots with occasional gusts to 55. Runway conditions appear good despite the rain. Copy, Escort 1. We have the runway in sight. This is actually going to work. Sarah could hear the relief beginning to creep into Captain Williams' voice. But she knew the most dangerous part was still ahead. Landing a crippled commercial aircraft in severe crosswinds required precise timing and flawless execution. United 847, at 200 feet you're going to encounter a significant wind shift. Be prepared for a strong push from the left that will require immediate correction. Roger, Escort 1. Standing by for wind shift. The massive jet descended through the storm with steady precision. Sarah could see it clearly now through her rain-streaked canopy. A United Airlines 777 with one engine completely shut down and another running rough, carrying 312 souls who had no idea how close they had come to disaster. Wind shift now, Sarah called out as her own aircraft was suddenly buffeted by the changing conditions. She watched as United 847's nose swung briefly to the right before Captain Williams corrected with expert precision. The aircraft straightened out and continued its descent toward the runway threshold. Beautiful correction, United 847. You're lined up perfectly. 50 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. The main landing gear touched down with a spray of water from the rain-soaked runway. For a heart-stopping moment, the aircraft bounced slightly before settling firmly onto the ground. The nose gear came down smoothly, and Sarah could see the reverse thrusters engaging as the pilots worked to bring the massive jet to a stop. United 847 is down safely, Sarah announced over the radio, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. Excellent landing, Captain Williams. Absolutely textbook. Escort 1, this is United 847, came the response, and now Captain Williams' voice was thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. That guidance was everything. We couldn't have done this without you. Sarah banked her T-38 around for her own landing approach. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the realization of what had just been accomplished. 312 people were safe on the ground because a group of professionals had been willing to try something unconventional. Her own landing was routine compared to what United 847 had just accomplished. The T-38 touched down smoothly and rolled to a stop near the hangar where her adventure had begun just over an hour earlier. As Sarah shut down the aircraft and climbed out of the cockpit, she could see emergency vehicles surrounding United 847. But instead of responding to a crash, they were there to provide assistance to passengers and crew who were walking away from what could have been one of the worst aviation disasters in recent history. Colonel Martinez was waiting for her with a broad smile and a cup of coffee that she accepted gratefully. Ms. Chun, I have to say that was some of the most impressive flying I've seen in 30 years of military aviation, he said. The escort guidance technique worked perfectly. How are the passengers? Sarah asked, her primary concern now that the immediate crisis was over. All 312 souls on board are safe and accounted for. A few minor injuries from turbulence during the flight, but nothing serious. The crew is being debriefed, and Captain Williams specifically requested to speak with you. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in the base operations center, still wearing her flight suit, and feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the number of people who wanted to congratulate her. Captain Williams approached with his co-pilot and flight engineer in tow. Ms. Chun, Captain Williams said, extending his hand. I need to tell you that in 28 years of commercial aviation, I have never experienced anything like what you just did for us. Your guidance didn't just help us land safely. It probably saved every life on that aircraft. Sarah shook his hand, feeling embarrassed by the praise. Captain, you and your crew did all the hard work. I just provided a little extra information. A little extra information? The co-pilot, a woman in her 40s, laughed. You flew escort through a severe storm and talked us down in conditions that would normally ground all air traffic. That wasn't just extra information. That was extraordinary pilot skill. Director Morrison arrived from Seattle about an hour later, along with several officials from the Federal Aviation Administration and United Airlines. The small conference room at Fairchild was soon crowded with people who all wanted to understand exactly how the unconventional rescue had been accomplished. Ms. Chun, said the senior FAA investigator. We're going to need a full debrief of this operation. What you accomplished tonight is going to become a case study for emergency rescue procedures. Sarah spent the next 3 hours explaining her weather routing decisions, the escort guidance technique, and the specific challenges they had faced during the approach and landing. Every detail was recorded and analyzed by investigators who seemed amazed that such a complex operation had been successful. The question now, Director Morrison said, is whether this technique could be standardized for future emergency situations. It could work, Sarah replied thoughtfully, but it would require extensive training and specific aircraft resources. This isn't something that could be improvised during an emergency. It needs to be a planned capability. Would you be interested in helping develop that capability? Asked the United Airlines operations manager. We're going to be implementing new emergency procedures based on tonight's success, and we could use someone with your expertise. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the offer. For the past several years, she had been content with crop dusting, simple flying that kept her in the air without the stress and responsibility of more complex operations. But tonight had reminded her why she had become a pilot in the first place. I think I would be very interested in that, she said finally. 6 months later, Sarah Chun was working as a senior consultant for the Federal Aviation Administration, developing new protocols for emergency aircraft escort operations. Her technique had been refined and incorporated into training programs for both military and civilian pilots. The story of United 847's rescue had become legendary in aviation circles, but Sarah was most proud of a letter she had received from a 7-year-old girl named Emma, whose grandmother had been on the flight. Dear Pilot Sarah, the letter read in crayon. Thank you for saving my grandma. She told me you were very brave and that you flew through a big storm to help her airplane land safely. When I grow up, I want to be a pilot just like you. Sarah had framed the letter and hung it in her office, where it served as a daily reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept that something is impossible. The crop duster who had been dismissed as an amateur had become one of the most respected emergency aviation specialists in the country. But, more importantly, 312 people had gone home to their families because someone had been willing to challenge assumptions and try something that had never been done before. In aviation, as in life, sometimes the person who looks least likely to be a hero turns out to be exactly the hero you need. And sometimes, the most important qualification for solving an impossible problem is simply the courage to believe that there might be a solution that no one else has thought of yet. Sarah never returned to crop dusting. Her new career involved training the next generation of pilots to think creatively in emergency situations, to look beyond standard procedures when lives were at stake, and to remember that the best solutions sometimes come from the most unexpected sources. And whenever she told the story of that stormy night to her students, she always ended with the same lesson. Never dismiss someone's offer to help just because they don't look like what you expect a hero to look like. Some of the most capable people in the world are the ones who don't feel the need to prove it until the moment when it really matters.